The year was 1942. The world was at war, and the frozen wilderness of Greenland was no place for human life. Endless white stretched to the horizon, a place so vast and silent that even sound seemed to freeze in mid-air. Yet across that emptiness, a formation of American aircraft thundered low through the clouds. 6 sleek P-38 Lightning fighters and 2 B-17 bombers. Their mission was routine, at least by wartime standards, a ferry flight from the United States to England, part of a steady flow of new planes joining the fight in Europe. But what happened that July afternoon would turn an ordinary transfer mission into one of the most remarkable aviation stories ever told. A story that would sleep, literally, under ice for half a century. The plan was simple on paper. The aircraft would hop north from Maine to Newfoundland, cross to Greenland, then continue to Iceland and on to Britain. The P-38 Lightnings were new, twin-engined fighters famous for their speed and distinctive twin-boom tails. They were escorted by 2 flying fortresses acting as navigational leaders. It was the safest way to move them across an ocean filled with storms and uncertainty. Halfway across Greenland, the weather turned. A dense fog rolled in from the coast, swallowing the sunlight. Snow whipped across the windscreens. Radio signals crackled with static. The formation was forced to circle, looking for a gap in the clouds. But there was none. Ice began to build on the wings, and fuel gauges crept lower with every minute. "Better find a place to set down," came the order over the radio. In a land without airfields, that was easier said than done. The lead bomber's pilot, Lieutenant Brad McManus, spotted a flat stretch of ice near the coast, a glacier field. It was their only chance. One by one, the heavy bombers and fighters came down, landing on the snow-covered surface with engines roaring and wheels biting into powder. Miraculously, all 8 aircraft touched down safely. No one was hurt. They had landed on what would later be called the Greenland ice cap. What the pilots didn't know was that this spot, this field of ice, was not stable ground. It was a living, shifting glacier, moving slowly, year after year, covering everything in its path. Rescue planes tried to reach them, but the weather refused to cooperate. After several days of freezing winds and dwindling supplies, the stranded crews were picked up by dog sled and eventually evacuated. Their aircraft, still intact, were left behind. 8 machines waiting in the cold, engines silent, canopies dusted with snow. They called the location Lost Squadron. Then time began to do what time always does in Greenland. It buried everything. Winter after winter, layer after layer of snow pressed down. The planes disappeared from sight, frozen inside the ice like prehistoric insects in amber. By the time the world forgot about them, they lay more than 75 meters below the surface. For half a century, the glacier moved forward, grinding the metal to dust, or so everyone believed. Decades passed. The war ended. Men walked on the moon. Jet engines replaced propellers, and the P-38 became a museum piece. But for a few dreamers back in America, the Lost Squadron was not forgotten. In the late 1970s, 2 aviation enthusiasts, Pat Epps and Richard Taylor, began to talk about the legend of the buried planes. Could they still be there? Could they be recovered? At first, most people laughed. "Impossible," they said. Even if they survived, they'd be crushed by ice or twisted beyond repair. But Epps and Taylor didn't laugh. They believed that history was still sleeping under that glacier, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig it out. In 1981, they launched their first expedition. They arrived in Greenland with little more than enthusiasm and a rough idea of where the planes had gone down. Using old military maps, they marked a likely area, a patch of white among white, and began drilling through the ice. They found nothing. Year after year they returned, drilling holes, sending radar pulses, mapping the invisible world below their feet. Still nothing. Most men would have quit. But Epps was not most men. He was an Atlanta pilot and showman with a deep love for vintage aircraft. To him, finding one of those P-38s wasn't just about metal. It was about memory. It was proof that history could be rescued, piece by frozen piece. By 1992, after more than a decade of failed attempts, they tried again with better technology, ground-penetrating radar. This time, the radar returned a faint echo, a metallic shape buried 268 feet, 81 meters, below the surface. After 50 years of silence, the lost squadron had answered. When the first tunnel reached the aircraft, the team couldn't believe their eyes. The ice had preserved everything. The metal gleamed under artificial light, like a ghost caught in crystal. The aircraft's name, faint but still visible on the fuselage, was P-38 Glacier Girl. It had slept for 50 years in perfect darkness. They began the painstaking work of cutting the plane free, melting tunnels with steam, disassembling parts, and hauling each piece up to the surface through a narrow shaft. The conditions were brutal. Minus 30 degrees, endless daylight, engines freezing, equipment failing. But every bolt, every panel, every wing section that reached the open air was a victory, a handshake across time. What started as a wartime emergency landing had become one of the greatest recoveries in aviation history. A forgotten fighter, entombed in ice since 1942, was about to fly again. But that part of the story, the resurrection, would take another decade and an unimaginable amount of patience, money, and faith. For now, as the team stood beside the shining fragments on the ice, they knew they were holding something more than aluminum. They were holding the fire past, and it was finally breathing again. When the drill broke through to metal, there was a silence no one expected. For days, the team had listened to nothing but the hiss of steam and the groan of generators, but now the sound that came back through the ice was different, a hollow echo, the unmistakable ring of aluminum. Pat Epps looked up from the instrument panel and grinned through the frost on his beard. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice trembling with disbelief, "we found her." The men gathered around the narrow shaft, peering into the darkness below. A faint glint of silver caught the light from the work lamps. 50 years of snow and pressure had turned the glacier into a tomb, and now, at last, they were standing at its door. They called it the Ice Queen's grave, and freeing her would be like digging through time itself. The first step was to melt their way down to the aircraft. The team used a device they called the Super Gopher, a strange homemade contraption that pumped hot steam down a long hose, eating through the ice 1 inch at a time. It was slow, dangerous work. The tunnel had to go straight down for almost 270 feet. Every foot deeper meant greater risk. Walls could collapse, ice could shift, machinery could fail. They worked in pairs, 8 hours at a time, in temperatures that froze fuel lines and stiffened their gloves until they could hardly move their fingers. Still, they kept going. Each burst of steam was another heartbeat closer to history. When the tunnel finally reached the fuselage, the lights revealed something extraordinary. The plane wasn't destroyed. The glacier had wrapped itself around her like a cold cocoon, preserving the aluminum skin so well that the stenciled numbers and insignia were still visible. There were bullet holes on the wings, memories of a war long past. But the shape, the grace of the P-38 Lightning was unmistakable. Pat Epps brushed his hand across the metal. "She's beautiful," he whispered. For a moment, the men said nothing. The storm above was forgotten. All they could hear was the hum of the generator and the faint drip of melting ice. It was as if the glacier itself was surrendering its secret. They began to take the aircraft apart, carefully, piece by piece. Each section had to be melted free, labeled, and lifted through the narrow shaft to the surface. Wings, propellers, engines, cockpit. Everything was hauled up in crates. It took weeks. The ice fought them at every step, freezing equipment and snapping cables. At one point, a section of the tunnel caved in, nearly trapping a worker below. But no one quit. They knew that what they were saving was not just a machine. It was a story. A story about a time when the world was on fire, and a group of young men had landed here by luck and lived to tell about it. By the end of that summer in 1992, the frozen remains of Glacier Girl lay spread across the surface of Greenland. Silver pieces glinting under the pale, midnight sun. Looking at them, it was hard to believe they had been asleep for half a century. Every rivet, every dent told a story. The panic of that landing in 1942, the quiet years beneath the snow, and now the rebirth. The team posed for a photo beside the scattered parts. Tired, frost-bitten, but smiling. They had done what the world said was impossible. As Pat Epps said to a journalist later, "We didn't just find an airplane. We found proof that time doesn't win every fight." When the season ended, the team packed the crates onto a cargo plane bound for the United States. They watched from the runway as the last pallet disappeared into the hold. It was a bittersweet moment. The glacier closed again, silent and endless. But somewhere beneath that ice, 7 more planes still slept. For now, though, the Glacier Girl was going home. Back to warmth, back to air, back to life. When the last crate touched American soil, the crowd that gathered around it wasn't large, just a handful of mechanics, dreamers, and believers who had followed the story for years. The metal inside those boxes looked ordinary to most people, but to Pat Epps and his team, it was sacred. It was the body of Glacier Girl, a time traveler from the year 1942, carried home after 50 years under the ice. They unloaded the parts carefully, like archaeologists handling ancient bones. Each section, wing spars, engines, and tail booms, was coated with a thin film of frost that steamed in the Tennessee heat. The aircraft had crossed from ice back into air, from silence back into noise, and now they faced a question that seemed almost impossible. Could she ever fly again? The restoration began in Middlesboro, Kentucky, a small town tucked in the Appalachian Mountains. A hangar was cleared, tools were gathered, and word spread quickly through the local community that the plane from the ice had arrived. Visitors came from miles around to see it. Old veterans walked in quietly, some in tears, placing their hands on the cold aluminum skin. "It's like touching a ghost," one man said. Epps had a vision to restore Glacier Girl to flying condition, exactly as she was the day she landed in Greenland. But as they began to disassemble the parts, the true scale of the challenge became clear. The ice had preserved the aircraft, but also warped it. Every bolt had to be replaced, every wire rebuilt. Even the engines, 2 massive Allison V-1710s, were frozen solid inside. "It's like rebuilding a snowflake," Epps told a reporter. "Every piece has to fit perfectly, or it all disappears." Month after month, they worked. They cleaned, sanded, welded, measured. Some nights, the hangar lights burned past midnight, the sound of rivet guns echoing against the mountain walls. The deeper they went, the more they realized what they had found. Not just an airplane, but a symbol of endurance. There were setbacks. Money ran short. Parts had to be custom-made since no one had built a P-38 in half a century. And then came the news no one wanted to hear. The restoration company that owned Glacier Girl went bankrupt. For a time, the project seemed doomed again. Not by snow, but by paperwork. The plane that had survived the coldest place on Earth was now trapped by red tape. But history has a way of attracting its own guardians. An aviation enthusiast named Roy Schaffner, a Kentucky businessman and pilot, stepped in. He bought the aircraft, hired back the same crew, and promised to finish what Epps had started. "Some people collect paintings," he said. "I collect dreams." Under Schaffner's guidance, the restoration took on new life. The hangar buzzed again. Slowly, the P-38 began to look whole, the sleek twin booms taking shape, the propellers glinting under the work lights. Technicians reassembled the cockpit, polished the glass canopy, and painted her in the original olive drab and gray camouflage, just as she appeared in 1942. It was no longer just metal and wires. It was her again, Glacier Girl. By early 2002, after nearly a decade of work, the restoration was nearly complete. The plane gleamed like new. People began to whisper the question everyone had been afraid to ask aloud. Will she really fly? The answer would come on October 26, 2002. Thousands gathered at the Middlesbrough airport. The crowd was filled with veterans, children, and families. Many of them had watched the recovery on television years earlier. As the hangar doors opened, sunlight spilled across the polished aluminum. Two mechanics guided the aircraft out onto the runway. The engines turned slowly, coughing, sputtering, and then, finally, roared to life. The sound was deep and powerful, like thunder echoing across time. Men cheered, women cried, and for a moment the decades between 1942 and 2002 simply disappeared. When Glacier Girl lifted off the runway for the first time in 60 years, it wasn't just a flight. It was resurrection. The crowd watched her climb into the blue Kentucky sky, her twin engines slicing through the air as gracefully as ever. Below, Pat Epps stood quietly, eyes shining. "She's home," he said. "After all these years, she finally came home." The plane circled once over the mountains, sunlight glinting off her wings, and then disappeared into the distance, just as she had half a century earlier. But this time, she wasn't flying to war. She was flying for every dream that had been buried, forgotten, or told it was impossible. When Glacier Girl touched down after that first flight, the applause didn't stop for minutes. People weren't cheering for a machine. They were cheering for everything it stood for: perseverance, memory, and the stubborn refusal to let history fade away. For many in that crowd, the sound of those engines was like a voice from their youth, a voice they hadn't heard since the war. Pat Epps stood by the runway, tears on his face, and whispered, "She never gave up on us." The P-38 Lightning, once buried in ice and silence, was now reborn as a living monument, and she didn't stay grounded. In the years that followed, Glacier Girl flew at air shows across the United States, from Oshkosh to California, gleaming under the sun, her engines singing the same song they had sung over Europe in 1942. Crowds would fall silent as she took off. Children pointed, veterans saluted, and photographers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the plane that had literally come back from the dead. Pilots who flew her said she handled like a dream, smooth, balanced, alive. One of them, pilot Steve Hinton, described it best. "When you push the throttle forward, you don't just feel power, you feel history. You feel all the hands that dug her out of the ice, every man who risked his life to bring her home." At each show, there was always a moment when Glacier Girl would pass low over the runway and wag her wings. A small, graceful salute to the people below. It became her trademark. Over the years, she became more than an airplane. She became a bridge between generations. World War II veterans would bring their grandchildren and point up at her, saying softly, "That's what courage sounds like." Younger people, born decades after the war, learned something different. That history isn't something you read about in books. Sometimes it's something you can see, hear, and touch. In museums and documentaries, Glacier Girl reminded them that the past doesn't stay buried unless we let it. Her story spread far beyond aviation circles. Newspapers called it the most remarkable aircraft recovery in history. Documentaries were made, and her image, twin booms cutting through the clouds, became a symbol of endurance against time itself. But the story didn't end there. In 2007, Glacier Girl was scheduled to complete the journey she had begun in 1942, flying from the United States across Greenland to England. It would be a symbolic completion of the mission that her squadron never finished. She made it across the Atlantic, but weather once again intervened. Heavy storms forced the team to divert. It was almost poetic. The same kind of sky that had brought her down 65 years earlier was still reminding them who was really in control. Still, the attempt captured hearts around the world. It wasn't about reaching England anymore. It was about showing that dreams, no matter how delayed, are never truly lost. Today, Glacier Girl rests in a museum hangar, polished, protected, and admired by thousands each year. She sits beneath bright lights, her nose art restored, her propellers still as if waiting for the next flight. Visitors walk slowly around her, reading the small plaque that tells her story, but it's the sound that most of them imagine, the deep rumble of those twin engines echoing through cold air. And somewhere deep in Greenland, 7 more P-38s remain buried under the ice. The rest of the lost squadron, still waiting. Perhaps one day someone else will find them. Perhaps not. Either way, Glacier Girl proved something powerful. That time can cover history, but it can't erase it. Pat Epps, the man who refused to stop searching, once said in an interview, "When I first touched that plane, I wasn't touching metal. I was shaking hands with 1942. That's what the Glacier Girl truly represents, a handshake across time. A reminder that even in the coldest, darkest places, the past can still speak to us if we're willing to listen." As the museum lights dim each evening, her silver wings reflect the soft glow of the lamps. Outside, the world keeps moving, cars, people, new stories. But inside that hangar, one airplane stands as proof that hope can be frozen for 50 years and still take flight again. While Glacier Girl captured headlines and hearts, her story was only one chapter of a much larger mystery. When those 8 aircraft landed on the Greenland ice cap in July of 1942, they didn't land together in one neat row. They scattered across miles of ice. 6 P-38 Lightnings and 2 B-17 Flying Fortresses, each swallowed by snow at a slightly different spot. When rescuers evacuated the crews that summer, they marked the coordinates as best they could. But glaciers, like time, never stand still. Over the next 50 years, the ice moved more than 2 miles, twisting and crushing everything beneath it. That's why when Pat Epps and his team began their search, it was like looking for a ghost that had drifted away. And even though they found Glacier Girl, the rest of the lost squadron still sleeps beneath that endless white, buried deeper each year by the slow heartbeat of the Earth itself. To understand the scale of what those men faced, you have to imagine the Greenland ice cap. It's not just frozen ground. It's alive. It shifts, it breathes, it flows. Every summer, meltwater seeps down into cracks, freezing again in winter and expanding with a force strong enough to bend metal and crush rock. Some scientists say it moves up to 30 feet every year. For the planes of the lost squadron, that meant they were slowly pulled down and forward, entombed in layers of solid ice thicker than a skyscraper is tall. Their aluminum wings and propellers, once symbols of power, became tiny relics drifting inside a living glacier. When the Glacier Girl team first realized this, they knew recovering even one airplane would be a miracle. Recovering all 8 might take a lifetime. And yet, people tried. After Epps's success in 1992, other explorers and historians began organizing expeditions to find the remaining aircraft. Some had corporate sponsors, others were private adventurers who had grown up dreaming about the lost squadron. They brought new technology: radar, satellite imaging, ice-penetrating sonar. But the challenges were the same. Brutal weather, shifting ice, and isolation that tested every human limit. A few teams located metallic echoes deep below, but none have managed to bring another plane to the surface. Every expedition ends with the same haunting sound: the low rumble of ice moving beneath their feet, as if the glacier itself is guarding its secret. Still, they keep coming back. Because the Lost Squadron isn't just about airplanes. It's about human persistence. The idea that even if you never reach the finish line, the journey itself still matters. One explorer who joined the later expeditions described it perfectly. When you stand out there, surrounded by nothing but wind and white, you realize how small you are, and yet you're part of something huge. A story that started before you were born and will keep going long after you're gone. That's why they keep drilling. Keep listening for the faint metallic ping of radar bouncing off aluminum. Each sound could be another Glacier Girl, waiting for her turn to breathe again. There are rumors that one of the missing B-17s lies only a few hundred meters from where Glacier Girl was found. But every year, the ice grows deeper. At this rate, it might be another 50 years before the next recovery is possible, if the glacier hasn't claimed it completely by then. For those who were part of the original mission in 1942, the Lost Squadron became a symbol of something bigger than war. It represented the courage of survival, not just in battle, but in life. The 8 crews who landed that day all made it home, but their airplanes stayed behind, frozen in time as monuments to the moment they refused to give up. Even now, veterans' families sometimes travel to Greenland, standing on the vast white plain where the Lost Squadron disappeared. They bring small flags or flowers sealed in glass and lay them on the snow. There's nothing to see. No wreckage, no marker, just the wind. But for them, it's enough. They know what lies below, and they know that someday, maybe long after they're gone, someone will find the others. Back in Kentucky, Glacier Girl sits in her hangar, polished and proud. But on her left wing, there's a small emblem painted by her restoration crew, a silhouette of 7 other aircraft flying in formation behind her. It's a quiet tribute to those that still sleep under the ice. When asked what he thought about the plane still buried in Greenland, Pat Epps smiled and said, "They're not lost. They're just waiting for someone stubborn enough to find them." Before Glacier Girl became a legend, she was just one of 6 fighters in a squadron of young men barely out of their 20s. They were not heroes then, just pilots doing their duty, ferrying new planes across the Atlantic to help in a war that seemed to have no end. On July 15, 1942, they left Goose Bay, Labrador, under clear skies. By the time they reached Greenland, the weather had turned against them, a wall of cloud and ice that swallowed everything. Captain Brad McManus, flying the lead P-38, was the first to realize they couldn't go on. Fuel was running low, visibility was gone, and their radio contact with base was fading fast. He took a deep breath and gave the order that no pilot ever wants to give. All aircraft, prepare to belly land. The pilots knew what that meant. They had never trained for glacier landings. They didn't know what waited beneath the snow, crevasses, ridges, or worse. But there was no choice. One by one, the P-38s came down, engines roaring against the cold air. McManus's fighter hit first, skidding across the ice, throwing up a wave of snow. Another followed, then another. The last plane came in too fast and broke a propeller, but the pilot crawled out unharmed. Amazingly, every man survived. They were stranded, yes, but alive. They gathered near the wrecks, the wind howling around them. Snow was already drifting over the wings. One of the crewmen, Sergeant Harry Smith, later said, "When the engine stopped, it was so quiet it hurt your ears." They set up camp between the planes, using parachutes for shelter. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Their food supply was small: chocolate, canned meat, and emergency rations. At night, they took turns keeping watch, though there was nothing to see but stars. For 5 days they waited, hoping for rescue planes to find them. When a B-17 from Iceland finally spotted a faint reflection on the ice, it took 3 more days before anyone could reach them by dog sled. The rescue team, led by Danish explorers familiar with the terrain, fought blizzards and ice cracks to reach the stranded Americans. When they finally appeared on the horizon, the pilots thought they were dreaming. They were taken to a coastal station, exhausted but unharmed. For weeks afterward, they couldn't believe they'd made it out alive. To them, the airplanes they left behind were just machines, expendable tools of war. No one imagined that those same aircraft would become legends half a century later. Years passed. The war ended. Some of the pilots went back to flying. Others left aviation behind altogether. But the memory of that frozen day never left them. When word reached them in the 1980s that someone was trying to find the lost squadron, a few of the surviving crew members laughed in disbelief. "Those planes, they're gone," one said. "The ice swallowed them." But when Glacier Girl finally emerged in 1992, several of them watched the news, footage with tears in their eyes. Captain Brad McManus, by then an old man with white hair and trembling hands, said in an interview, "It's like seeing a piece of your youth come back to life. We thought we'd never see her again. We didn't know she'd been waiting for us all this time." He was invited to the unveiling of Glacier Girl in Kentucky, but was too frail to travel. Instead, the restoration team sent him a small piece of metal from the plane, a rivet polished and mounted on a plaque. When a reporter asked what it meant to him, McManus smiled softly and said, "It means she's home. That's all that matters." The men of the lost squadron are gone now, but their voices remain. In interviews, letters, and the memories of their families. Their story isn't one of combat or medals. It's a story about endurance, courage, and trust. They faced death not in battle, but in the quiet, merciless cold of Greenland. And they did it together. Every time Glacier Girl takes to the sky today, she carries more than history in her wings. She carries their names, their laughter, their fear, and their relief. She is their legacy, a frozen moment of bravery turned into living memory. For every story about a plane that refuses to die, there's a story about the people who refuse to let it die. Glacier Girl may have been made of metal, but the men who found her were built from something just as strong: determination. At the center of it all was Pat Epps, a pilot and aviation showman from Atlanta. He wasn't a soldier or a scientist. He was a man with a dream and a sense of adventure that wouldn't quit. When he first heard the legend of the lost squadron in the late 1970s, it wasn't a historical curiosity to him. It was a challenge. "I just couldn't stand the thought of those airplanes being out there," he said. "They were part of our history, and I wanted to bring one home." Epps teamed up with Richard Taylor, another pilot and mechanic who shared his obsession. Together, they planned their first expedition in 1981. It was a small operation, no major sponsors, no modern radar, just a few drills, some maps, and a whole lot of courage. They didn't find anything that year, or the year after, or the 10 years after that. Most people would have given up, but Pat Epps wasn't built for quitting. He sold part of his airshow business to fund the next trip. He borrowed money. He asked friends for favors. And each summer, he went back to that same spot on the Greenland ice cap, convinced that the planes were still there, waiting. By the time the breakthrough came in 1992, Epps and Taylor had become local legends in aviation circles, the crazy guys digging in the ice. They had spent more than a decade drilling through hundreds of feet of glacier, facing blizzards, engine failures, and even frostbite. They lost equipment to the cold, ran out of supplies, and watched friends drop out one by one. But somehow, they kept smiling. Epps once said, "When you do something like this, you either go broke or you make history. Sometimes you do both." When the Glacier Girl finally emerged, they had indeed made history, but at a cost. The expedition left them deep in debt, exhausted, and uncertain about the future. Yet even in that chaos, they felt something greater than success. They had proven that human will could dig through ice, and through time itself. As the years passed, new people joined their circle. Among them was Roy Schaffner, the Kentucky businessman who would later buy and restore the aircraft. Schaffner wasn't just a financier. He became the guardian of the dream. He poured his resources into rebuilding the plane, not for fame, but for legacy. "Some people invest in stocks," he said. "I invest in stories." The bond between Epps, Taylor, and Schaffner was complicated. They argued, disagreed, and sometimes fell out over ownership and credit. But beneath it all was mutual respect, the kind that comes from shared hardship. In interviews, they all said the same thing in different words. The plane belongs to history, not to us. In the 2000s, after the plane's first flight, the men reunited at air shows and anniversaries. They stood together under Glacier Girl's wings, watching the sunlight play off the polished aluminum. By then, the frostbite scars had faded, but the memories hadn't. Each man carried a piece of that glacier inside him, the endless white, the hum of the drills, the moment when they first saw metal gleam in the dark. When Richard Taylor passed away years later, his family scattered a small portion of his ashes on the Greenland ice cap, at the very spot where Glacier Girl had been found. It was his request. He had said once, "If I ever leave this world, put me back where the dream started." Pat Epps, now an old man, still speaks about the project with the same fire in his eyes. He says he doesn't regret a single moment. "If I hadn't gone," he told an interviewer, "I'd have spent my whole life wondering what was under that ice." He keeps a small piece of Glacier Girl's wing in his home office, polished smooth, sitting on a wooden stand. Visitors always ask why he doesn't keep it in a museum. He smiles and says, "Because sometimes you need a reminder that the impossible isn't really impossible. It's just waiting for you to melt the ice. There are stories that fade with time. And then there are stories that grow stronger the longer they're told. Glacier Girl belongs to the second kind. Her story didn't end with that first triumphant flight in 2002. If anything, that was just the beginning of a new chapter, one written not in ice and metal, but in memory. Today, when visitors step into the hangar where she rests, they don't just see a restored aircraft. They see a mirror. They see themselves, their fathers, their grandfathers, their country, their own sense of persistence reflected in aluminum and rivets. Children stare up at her twin tails, hearing the guides tell how she slept under the ice for 50 years. Older men smile quietly, remembering the sound of piston engines and the courage of a generation that refused to give up. Over the decades, Glacier Girl has become something rare, a bridge between eras. For historians, she's a mechanical marvel, a frozen time capsule of World War II engineering. For pilots, she's a testament to the beauty of flight, the perfect balance of form and function. But for most people, she represents something deeper, the human instinct to recover, rebuild, and remember. In a world that often moves too fast, Glacier Girl reminds us that patience and faith can still change what seems impossible. Her rescue wasn't powered by technology alone. It was powered by people who refused to stop believing. When visitors stand beneath her wings, they can almost hear the voices of those who touched her story. The young pilots who landed in 1942, the rescuers who braved the cold, and the dreamers who dug her out of the ice half a century later. Each of them left something behind, a trace of their breath, their effort, their hope, frozen forever in the story of one airplane. Every so often, Glacier Girl is rolled out of her hangar to fly again. Not often, just enough to remind the sky that she's still alive. When her engines start, there's a hush among the crowd. People take off their hats, children cover their ears, and the first deep rumble of her twin Allisons echoes across the field. For a few seconds, it feels as if time folds in on itself. She lifts off, slow and steady, sunlight flashing across her wings. The same plane that once vanished beneath a glacier now soars above green hills and open fields. It's more than flight. It's resurrection, repeated again and again. And as she climbs, you can almost imagine the other 7 planes, still sleeping beneath the ice, watching her rise through the clouds, waiting for their turn to wake. In the years since her recovery, Glacier Girl has inspired books, documentaries, and museums. Schools teach her story as an example of perseverance. Pilots hang her photo in their workshops as a reminder of why they fell in love with flying. And somewhere, deep in Greenland, new explorers still listen for faint metallic echoes under the ice. They say that if you stand there long enough in the silence, you can hear something faint, like a whisper under the wind. Maybe it's just the glacier moving, or maybe it's history, trying to breathe again, because history never really sleeps. It just waits for someone patient enough to find it. Pat Epps once said, near the end of his life, "People think we found an airplane. We didn't. We found proof that dreams don't rust." That line has since been engraved on a small plaque inside Glacier Girl's hangar. Visitors stop to read it, then look up at the plane in front of them. Her wings stretched wide, her nose pointed toward the light. She's still beautiful, still timeless, still a reminder that even when the world forgets, there are always a few who remember. The glacier may have tried to claim her, the years may have tried to bury her, but in the end, Glacier Girl outlasted them all. And as long as there are people who believe that history matters, that courage matters, her engines will never truly fall silent. Because some stories don't belong to the past, they belong to everyone who still dares to believe that the impossible is worth digging for. Some stories end with a victory. Others end with silence. But Glacier Girl ends with both. Beneath the endless white of Greenland, her sisters still sleep. 6 more P-38s entombed in crystal, untouched since 1942. They lie there, perfectly preserved, like metallic fossils from another age. No one knows if they'll ever be found again. Maybe that's how it should be, because sometimes history needs its mysteries. When the wind sweeps across the ice, it carries the sound of snow brushing over aluminum, a whisper that says, "I'm still here." And somewhere, far away, a veteran hears that whisper in his dreams and smiles, remembering a time when courage had wings. In a way, Glacier Girl belongs not just to the men who found her or the men who flew her, but to everyone who ever refused to give up. Every mechanic who stayed late in a cold hangar, every explorer who kept digging when the storm said, "Go home." Every dreamer who believed that what was lost could still be found. Because that's what this story really is. Not about airplanes, but about endurance. About the stubborn light that flickers inside people and refuses to go out, no matter how heavy the ice becomes. In the final years of his life, Pat Epps was once asked if he would ever go back to Greenland to dig up another plane. He chuckled and said, "No, son, we already brought one back. That's enough. The rest can sleep." We proved our point. The ice can take things, but it doesn't get to keep them forever. That line says it all. The glacier can cover, bury, and silence, but it cannot erase. And so long as there are people who remember, the Glacier Girl will keep flying. If not in the sky, then in the stories we tell about her. Maybe one day, years from now, when the ice shifts again and the sun burns a little hotter, another wing will glint through the snow. Someone will see it, dig down, and find another piece of history, waiting patiently to be rediscovered. And when they do, they'll feel the same thing Pat Epps did the first time he touched that frozen wing. A jolt of connection across time. A reminder that even in the coldest places on Earth, humanity leaves a trace of warmth behind. So the next time you hear the deep rumble of a vintage engine in the distance, stop for a moment. Look up. Listen. Because maybe, Just maybe that sound isn't just another airplane passing overhead. Maybe it's Glacier Girl, reminding the world that the past is never truly gone. It's just waiting, beneath the ice, for someone brave enough to bring it home.